Hi, well, welcome. And we are in the midst of Ecclesiastes now, which Heather got us started in yesterday. And we were introduced to Koheleth, who is the writer, whoever that may be. And today, as we march on into the first 6 chapters, what we see is a literary device called self-description, which we might think of as plagiarism nowadays, but was pretty commonplace in those days, and the writer would actually claim to be another person. In this case, he claims to be Solomon because it helps him as he points to all of the things that he's trying to describe here. And what better person to use than Solomon, who can address all of these things, being the wisest person, and probably because the audience that this author was writing to were devotees of Solomon, and so it made perfect sense at this point. And basically, he's going to point out through a series of demonstrations that using all of his wisdom and exploring all possibilities, he's come to the conclusion on various levels that everything is meaningless and a grasping for the wind, which obviously we can do all day but not really get a hold of. So it does seem to be rather negative, but at the end I want to point a couple of things out for you. So as we go through here, he talks about number one, first of all, the search for wisdom, and can't find it. Because in the end, no matter how wise you are, no matter how much knowledge you are, he sees no point in it. It doesn't change the outcome. And so he moves on in chapter 2 to pleasure, talks about the lure of pleasure, and at the same time, in the end, even as Solomon, the ultimate in pleasures, enjoyment firsthand, still it did not save him. Death still came. There's no permanence. Was another theme running through there. Death comes to the fool as well as the wise, and no matter how much you prepare and try to avoid it, even Egyptian pharaohs who built their pyramids, death still comes, and when it comes, everything that you work to accumulate gets left behind. So the bottom line theme in chapter 2 in verses 24-25 is, number one, just enjoy life as best you can. And in chapter 26, surrender to God's decisions because God is in charge. And finally, ultimately, don't expect anything better. So it is rather a dour kind of statement and conclusion that's being drawn here. Now, if we're going to leave it at that, then the entirety of Ecclesiastes is going to be much the same. But as I said, in a moment, I'd like to maybe point us in a little bit of a different direction. We go on to chapter 3, and there's this discussion about the fact that God is in control. So nothing we do is going to make any difference. So you may as well not fret about the past or try to organize and plan and structure everything for the future, because it is what it is. Chapter 4, we see this demonstration about injustice and how it happens, and it's all over the place and pervasive, and that's just part of being human. And then we go into chapter 5, which kind of brings us to something a little different than just demonstrations about how Koheleth in his search and in using all of his wisdom has come to the conclusion that everything's meaningless. Now we get some words of advice here in chapter 5, and number one is watch out for stale religion, watch out for corrupt government, watch out for greed, watch out for all of those things in life. At least those are some words that the author is using at this point to offer some advice in the midst of everything that he has studied thus far. And then we go on in chapter 5 and on into chapter 6 with discussion about the futility of wealth and how it really doesn't lead you anywhere. And so we go through these chapters and we see all this discussion and all these rather negative sounding conclusions, and I would point out to you that would be true for us were it not for the fact in our lives that I think an even greater wise man came along down the road. We know him as God's Son, Jesus the Christ, and all of those things which the author was pointing to, which are worthless and meaningless and grasping for the wind, are things that in and of themselves human beings cannot attain. It's interesting how many of those things, if we look to Jesus Christ and his promises and his life and what he demonstrated, are the very things that we then are offered as believers who trust in Jesus. Jesus gives us that permanence. It gives us a mission in life now, but he also gives us an eternity with him. Jesus set us free. A much more positive view than what Koheleth was offering. Jesus brought justice to the world. He did not condone injustice. He didn't despair over it. And in the end, he brings justice. Jesus, as he talked about stale religion and corrupt government and greed, you remember Jesus spoke about those will worship me. When you're talking to the woman at the well, they will worship me in spirit and in truth. And he talked to Pontius Pilate, and he said, my kingdom's not of this world. And he spoke about save up for yourself treasures in heaven rather than wealth from this earth. So all of those things which this author here is pointing to from a human perspective as offering no meaning to Jesus Christ, once again, as we so often do, we find there is fulfillment. The answers to all of the questions find their truth in Jesus Christ. In the end, contentment is God's plan and his will for us. And doing that will and being content are more important than gaining anything and everything in this life. So, whereas the author of Ecclesiastes was not able to find any sense of satisfaction or contentment, we rest in the knowledge that Jesus has given us everything, both now and for eternity. So as we read through the rest of Ecclesiastes, think about not just this wise man who's speaking and writing, but also that greater wise man. And see if you can think of some of the things that Jesus offers that this writer does not. And I think as you do that, you'll be able to read Ecclesiastes in a much more positive way. So God's blessings on your day as you continue reading, and we'll talk to you again soon.